Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at a history that's just absolutely crucial for understanding the U.S. now. It covers, what, 5 centuries? And it often gets sidelined.
It really does. We're talking about the history of Latin America north of the Rio Grande.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A long, complicated, but really rich story.
And digging into the sources, our goal became pretty clear. We need to lay out this deep historical foundation. Because, as one source put it, you really can't get to greater humanity in how people are treated today without understanding this past.
Without the 500-year context.
Precisely. You need the whole story.
Okay, let's get into it. Because the beginning is, well, it's not what most people probably think. We think Cortez, Pizarro, right?
Yeah.
Calculated conquest for gold.
Right. But the first Spanish moves into what's now the U.S., they were actually driven by myth, pure legend, #I, the age of myth and exploration, early 16th century.
Myth, not strategy.
Well, not initially. They were searching for these fantastical places, things like the Isle of Bimini.
Ah, Bimini. And the Fountain of Youth, right? That was Ponce de Leon.
Exactly. That's what brought Ponce de Leon to Florida back in 1513. He was looking for the fountain.
So it's less military campaign, more like a quest fueled by these stories.
Completely. And that same energy was behind the search for the 7 cities of Cibola.
The 7 cities. Remind me.
Supposedly, these incredibly wealthy cities, founded way back by 7 Portuguese bishops who'd have fled the Muslim conquest of Europe, built somewhere out in the American Southwest, or so the legend went.
Wow. Okay. So these myth-driven ventures actually led to real exploration.
Oh, absolutely. Monumental exploration. You have to talk about Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. His journey is just incredible.
Cabeza de Vaca. He walked across the entire Southeast, didn't he? Took years.
8 years. Walking, surviving, mapping it out in his head, essentially. An unbelievable feat.
8 years. Just imagine. And his account, that became important.
Hugely important. In 1542, he published his relation, and this wasn't just an adventure story. It was basically the first real, comprehensive, topographical description of North America.
The first one.
The first one. The earliest maps, the first scientific-ish observations of the continent's interior, they came from these Spanish explorers who were initially chasing myths.
That's amazing they mapped it so early.
All right.
But it didn't lead to immediate, widespread Spanish settlement like in Mexico or Peru. Why not?
Well, the sources highlight a few key things. First, the distances were just enormous. Logistics were a nightmare.
Okay, makes sense.
Second, they ran into really strong resistance from indigenous groups. Think about Hernando de Soto's disastrous encounters near the Mississippi.
Right, not an easy conquest.
Not at all. And third, crucially, they didn't find the gold or silver or gems they were hoping for based on those Cibola myths without that quick profit motive.
The incentive just wasn't there for large-scale colonization north of Mexico.
Exactly. Not initially, anyway. #Tag2. Land claims, territory shifts, and conflict, 1565-1848.
Okay, so it was slow going. But they did establish a permanent spot eventually.
They did. St. Augustine, Florida, in 1565.
After kicking out some French colonists, right?
Yes, French Protestants. So St. Augustine becomes the first permanent European colony in North America.
But sounds like deep settlement was still pretty limited.
Very much so. It stayed concentrated closer to New Spain, so New Mexico and Texas. And even there, they faced constant conflict, major uprisings, like from the Pueblo Indians.
Right, and California came much later.
Much later. Firm Spanish control really only got established there in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. Military forts like Monterey and San Francisco weren't set up until 1770.
1770. So St. Augustine was kind of an outpost for over 200 years. But then things started changing fast in the early 19th century. Spain decides Florida isn't worth the hassle.
Pretty much. It was far-flung, expensive to defend. So in 1821, they sell it to the U.S. for $5 million.
$5 million.
Okay.
And right around then, Mexico gains its independence.
Yes. And the brand new Republic of Mexico inherits this vast northern territory from Spain, stretching all the way to Oregon, including Texas, California, the whole Southwest.
Which immediately creates friction with the United States, its northern neighbor.
Huge friction, especially in Texas. You see, after the U.S. bought Louisiana, you get this flood of Anglo-American settlers moving into Mexican Texas.
And the sources call this an anomalous demographic evolution.
That's the term used, yeah. These settlers were often required to be Catholic, but they brought very different cultural norms, language.
And crucially, different economic systems.
Yeah.
This leads to the flashpoint over slavery, doesn't it?
It does. This is critical. In 1829, Mexico abolishes slavery nationwide.
Abolishes it everywhere in Mexico.
Everywhere. But the Anglo-American settlers in Texas, their whole cotton-based economy relied on enslaved labor. So they rebelled against Mexico's abolition law.
So the fight wasn't just about independence. It was fundamentally about preserving slavery. That really reframes the Alamo story.
It does put it in a different context. The Battle of the Alamo in 1835, Mexican forces were initially victorious against the Anglo rebels.
But the rebellion continued.
Yes, the Mexican advance was eventually stopped at San Jacinto. Texas declared independence.
And then, fast forward a bit, the U.S. annexes Texas in 1845.
Correct. Mexico saw this as totally illegitimate, a hostile act. They cut diplomatic ties.
Leading directly to the U.S.-Mexico War.
Directly. U.S. troops invaded, marched all the way to Mexico City.
And the result? The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848.
A landmark treaty. Mexico cedes over 40% of its territory to the U.S. California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado and Wyoming.
All for $15 million.
$15 million. And the treaty included guarantees, supposedly, for the rights and citizenship of the Mexicans living in those annexed territories.
Supposedly. But the sources say the reality was quite different.
Understatement, yeah. Quite different indeed. Hashtag Tech 3. Labor, backlash, and new destinations. 1849 WWII.
So annexation happens, and then almost immediately, gold is discovered in California. 1849.
Talk about timing. The gold rush brings this enormous wave of Anglo and European immigrants pouring in.
Completely overwhelming the existing California, the Hispanic population.
Very quickly. And the consequences for those established communities were, frankly, devastating.
What kinds of things happened?
Widespread loss of land through legal trickery, outright theft, speculation. They were pushed out of political life. California even passed a foreign miners tax in 1850, largely aimed at Mexicans and Chinese miners.
So economic and political exclusion.
And cultural attacks, too. One really striking example from the sources. In 1855, California passed a law specifically banning Mexican cultural activities, things like fiestas, and even certain types of clothing.
Banning cultural expression. Wow.
It was so severe, thousands of Mexican families actually chose to leave California and move back across the border to Mexico.
That's incredible. But here's the paradox, right? Even as this is happening, the U.S. is industrializing like crazy.
Exactly. Factories, railroads, agriculture, all demanding huge amounts of labor.
And where do they look for that labor?
Increasingly back towards Mexico. You start seeing new waves of Mexican migrants coming north, not just the Southwest, but heading as far as Chicago, Pennsylvania, working on railroads, in steel mills, agriculture.
And the Mexican Revolution, starting around 1910, pushed even more people north.
Yes, that created a large population of refugees fleeing violence and instability, looking for safety and work in the U.S.
But even as the U.S. economy needed these workers, the policy environment was getting more restrictive.
It was. Early 20th century, you start seeing the first federal laws aimed at restricting immigration, setting quotas based on nationality.
Trying to control the flow.
Right. Though Mexican labor was often exempted or treated differently because it was so needed, especially in agriculture. But this environment led Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans to form organizations to protect themselves.
Like LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens.
Exactly. Founded to fight for civil rights, against discrimination in this increasingly complex and often hostile situation.
Okay, fast forward again. World War II. Huge turning point.
Massive turning point. Millions of American men go off to war, creating this enormous labor shortage, just as the U.S. economy is booming to supply the war effort.
So the need for workers becomes desperate.
Desperate, which leads the U.S. government to create the Bracero program.
Bracero, meaning manual labor, basically.
Right. It was an agreement with Mexico to bring in temporary workers, primarily for agriculture and railroad maintenance.
Supposed to be temporary.
Supposed to be. But it ran for decades, established these really deep migration networks. Many workers ended up staying or coming back repeatedly. It led to a major renewal and expansion of Mexican communities and cultural influence across the U.S. Hashtag Tag 5E. Diversifying waves and modern crises. Post-WWII 2025.
After the war, the picture starts to get even more diverse, doesn't it? It's not just migration from Mexico anymore.
Not at all. You see significant sustained migration from other parts of Latin America. Let's talk about Puerto Ricans first.
Okay, they were already U.S. citizens by this point, right?
Yes. The U.S. took Puerto Rico after the Spanish-American War, and the Jones Act in 1917 granted Puerto Ricans U.S. citizenship.
So they could move freely to the mainland. What drove the migration post-WWII?
A lot of it was economic displacement on the island. U.S. companies took over major industries: sugar, coffee, tobacco, which pushed small farmers off the land, combined with rapid urbanization and high unemployment.
People left for jobs on the mainland, New York, Chicago.
Exactly. Since they were citizens, there were no legal barriers to migration.
Okay. Then there's Cuba. There's some early migration. You mentioned cigar factories.
Yeah, late 19th century, Tampa, Key West. But the really big wave came after the 1959 Cuban Revolution.
Fidel Castro taking power.
Right. And that first wave was very distinct, often called the Golden Exile. These were largely educated, middle and upper class Cubans, professionals, business owners,
Fleeing Castro's government.
fiercely anti-Castro. They settled mainly in Florida, established this very successful, politically conservative community, very influential.
The later waves from Cuba were different. The Mario boat lift in 1980, for example.
Completely different. The Marielitos were generally poorer, more working class, more racially diverse, and, controversially, Castro included people released from prisons and mental hospitals in that exodus.
Which created a lot of social friction and negative stereotypes, famously depicted in films like Scarface.
It certainly shaped perceptions, yeah.
I
A much more complex and difficult integration process than that first wave.
Okay, let's jump to the 21st century. The sources break down recent migration into phases.
Yes, roughly 3 phases since 2000. First, 2000 to 2009. This is when Mexican immigration actually peaked and then started to fall sharply.
Really, it fell.
Dramatically.
Wow.
Border apprehensions dropped something like 90% from the peak in 2000, but at the same time, you saw migration from Central America increasing.
Driven by what?
Largely the long-term fallout from the civil wars in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, enduring violence, lack of opportunity. Tragically, this period also saw the rise of transnational gangs like MS-13 or Mara Salvatrucha, partly rooted in communities deported from the U.S. back to Central America.
Okay, so a shift from Mexico to Central America. What's the second phase, 2010 to 2019?
Diversification. The main growth isn't from Mexico or even primarily Central America anymore. It's increasingly from South America.
South America? Like where?
Especially Venezuela.
Yeah.
After 2015, the political and economic collapse under Maduro became catastrophic. Millions of Venezuelans fled the country, a massive refugee crisis impacting Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and increasingly the U.S.
A huge outflow.
Yeah.
And third phase, post-pandemic 2020 to now.
This is where the research shows a major resurgence in overall migration numbers. Record levels, really.
Driven by?
Primarily the devastating economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic across Latin America. It just shattered economies, wiped out jobs, pushed millions into deeper poverty.
When people sought opportunities elsewhere, including the U.S.
Exactly. And the diversification continued. South American arrivals jumped significantly from about 13% of the total between 2015-2019 up to 20% between 2021-2023.
So putting it all together, how much did Latin American immigration shape U.S. demographics recently?
The figures are pretty stark. In that post-pandemic surge, Latin American immigrants accounted for almost 60%, 58% of the entire growth in the foreign-born population in the U.S.
Nearly 6 out of every 10 new immigrants. Wow.
But this brings us right up to 2025, where the sources note that recent policy changes.
Under both the Trump and Biden administrations.
Yes, changes impacting asylum processes, restricting things like TPS, temporary protected status. These have led to a sharp decrease in overall immigration, bringing numbers down to, as the sources say, very low levels currently. #outcrow, what a journey.
500 years.
Ah.
From explorers literally searching for a fountain of youth.
Yeah, driven by myths.
Through conquest, annexation, cultural suppression, massive labor demands, revolutions, civil wars, economic crises. It's an incredibly complex tapestry.
It really is. And you see these cycles. A land originally explored and settled by Spanish speakers, taken by force by the U.S.
Then that same U.S. relies on labor from those regions, offers refuge at times, restricts entry at others.
Exactly. The demand for labor, the push of instability, it constantly brings people north across that border, that borderland region, regardless of the policies of the moment. It's this continuous flow back and forth across a line drawn relatively recently in historical terms.
Which brings us to that final thought, that question the sources leave us with. Think about it. The U.S. annexed nearly half of Mexico in 1848, promising rights and citizenship to the people already living there.
A promise that, as we saw, wasn't really kept in practice.
Right, now here we are, over 175 years later, and U.S. policy, as documented up to 2025, is restricting entry from those very same regions to historically low levels.
So the question for you, the listener, is how does knowing that history, that context of conquest and annexation, How does that change the way you view today's debates? The debates about immigration, about asylum, about borders.
Does that long view shift anything?
It's definitely something to reflect on.
Absolutely. A powerful question to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep exploring this long, vital history. We'll see you next time.